Welcome to Cut and Thrust, your podcast for the bloody and sometimes bizarre journey through the Middle Ages. Whether it's dark battles, questionable hygiene, or hair-raising rulers, here you'll get history as it really was, raw and unfiltered. So grab your sword, put on your helmet, and let's dive into the wild world of the past.
Hello and welcome to a new episode of the Battle Merchant podcast. I'm Hendrik.
And I'm Carmen, and today we're talking about true wonders of history, Viking longships.
The Viking longships weren't just boats, they were floating masterpieces that enabled the Norsemen to cover distances that other peoples thought impossible.
And what's fascinating is that these ships were far ahead of their time. Other medieval vessels were broader, deeper, more cumbersome. The longships, on the other hand, they were sleek as arrows. Sometimes the length-to-width ratio exceeded 6:1.
And that's exactly what made them so fast. Some replicas have briefly reached up to 28 kilometers per hour under ideal conditions. So that's peak speed. The average cruising speed was considerably lower. But still, just imagine sitting in a wooden boat without an engine and reaching those speeds.
Although speed was only part of it, the shallow keel was ingenious. They often had less than a meter of draft, sometimes only 50 or 60 centimeters. This meant they could sail up rivers, land on beaches where other ships couldn't reach.
And that was a huge strategic advantage. While the trading ships, the so-called knarrs, were built for heavy cargo on the open sea, the longships were
perfect for surprise attacks. They could literally appear out of nowhere.
They could even be transported over land. Just imagine that.
The secret lay in this combination of flexibility and strength. The clinker construction, where the planks overlap, gave the ship a natural elasticity. It could move with the waves instead of fighting against them.
And with this technique, the Vikings sailed all the way to North America. Leif Erikson, around the year 1000, but also into the Mediterranean, to Sicily, Spain, and via the rivers of Kiev and Rus all the way to Constantinople.
The range was truly remarkable. With replicas in experimental archaeology, this has been tested. Various reconstructions have crossed the Atlantic. One covered nearly 5,000 kilometers in just 27 days, with peak speeds over 20 kilometers per hour.
That shows how well thought out this design was. A typical longship was between 20 and 35 meters long, with a width of perhaps 3 to 5 meters. The crew usually numbered 40 to 70 men. Only the largest warships approached 100.
Though that varied, of course. More warriors for raiding voyages, fewer for longer journeys so they could carry more provisions. And everyone on board had their role.
What always fascinates me, they didn't have any construction plans. The boat builders knew it all from experience. Generations of knowledge passed down from master to apprentice.
And this experience was embedded in every detail. Which tree had the right grain for which part? How to split the planks so they'd be strong enough. This was true craftsmanship.
Exactly, and this craftsmanship, the construction techniques in detail, that's what we should talk about next. Because there's still plenty of fascinating stuff to explore.
Let's start right at the foundation. The wood.
Not just the external shape.
For instance, the exact choice of materials, right?
And that begins with selecting the wood. The boat builders preferred oak. Not just any wood.
Oak was ideal because of its hardness and natural resistance to rot. That was crucial for ships constantly exposed to salt water. And you know what? They even made sure to fell the trees in winter because the sap content was lower then. The wood dried better and lasted longer.
Exactly. They knew all this instinctively.
Experienced boat builders could actually tell at a glance which tree was best suited. It came down to straight-grown trunks with the right grain. That was knowledge trained over many years.
And then comes the crucial step. The planks weren't sawn, they were split.
Right, with axes and wedges, they
split the trunk along the natural grain.
That was the trick. When you saw, you destroy the fiber structure. When you split, the fibers stay intact, and you get much stronger planks. They ended up only about 2 centimeters thick, but incredibly resilient.
That's clever. Nature essentially did the work.
The work steps were fell the tree, quarter the trunk, position the wedges, split, smooth. And each of these steps required enormous skill. Afterward, the planks were fastened overlapping in the clinker technique.
Several advantages came together here. The overlap, combined with caulking and tar, kept the hull watertight while also providing flexibility for rough seas. And if a plank was damaged,
it could be replaced relatively easily. That was important for longer voyages. They had to be able to make repairs along the way.
And that's exactly what archaeological finds show, like the Skuldelev ships and the replicas at the Roskilde Museum. The techniques for repairs, for replacing planks, were crucial for ship integrity on long journeys.
With modern replicas in experimental archaeology, researchers try to recreate these techniques as authentically as possible. The challenge is that the experiential knowledge of the old masters wasn't written down in books. You have to rediscover it through practice.
Modern boat builders talk about how differently the wood responds when it's split rather than sawn. This vitality of the material, you might say.
This whole approach, from splitting the wood to the joining techniques, was designed for durability and maintainability.
So they didn't just plan for construction, but thought ahead to maintenance as well.
And that distinguishes the Viking method from later techniques. With carvel construction, which came later, the planks lie flush, side by side. That gives a smoother exterior, but less flexibility.
The Longships, on the other hand, they breathed. They moved, but they held together.
And that's what allowed the Vikings to reach waters where others couldn't go. Not just the speed, but this ability to work with the sea, rather than against it.
What's exciting is that today we are not just relying on historical finds. Through experimental archaeology, we can actually experience what it was like to sail on a Viking longship.
The most famous project is probably the Havhingsten from Glendalough, the sea stallion from Glendalough, a complete replica of a longship originally built in Ireland around 1042.
And the dimensions are impressive. 30 meters long, almost 4 meters wide, 60 oars. The Viking Ship Museum in Roskilde built it between 2000 and 2004, entirely with historical tools.
Huge amounts of fresh oak wood, hundreds of kilos of iron for the rivets, thousands of meters of hemp rope, and a sail of 112 square meters. In the end, the ship weighed over 8 tons, a true mammoth project.
And then came the real test. In 2007, the crew sailed this ship from Roskilde to Dublin, about 1,100 nautical miles, which took roughly 6 weeks.
And the scientists learned an incredible amount from it. Under sail, they averaged 6 to 8 knots. Theoretically, the ship could even reach up to 17 knots.
The insights were wide-ranging. For example,
the rowing. That was the only option when there was no wind.
And when rowing, the speed averaged only about 2.5 knots. Maximum maybe 4 knots. That shows just how important the wind was.
The physical demands were enormous. 60 to 70 men in a confined space, taking turns rowing, sometimes for hours on end. That required not just strength, but also coordination.
The crew members in these experiments report things you wouldn't expect. Not just the exertion, but also the cold, the wetness, the sleep deprivation.
Oh yes, and all that on an open deck. No protection from the elements, except maybe a sail used as a tarp.
Although that also shows how hardened the historical Vikings must have been. They didn't do this as an experiment, it was their everyday life.
And that underscores the value of experimental archaeology we already talked about. You can analyse finds, measure planks, count rivets, but the feeling when the ship moves with the waves, when the sail fills with wind, you only get that through experiencing it.
The scientists also discovered how sensitive the steering was. The side rudder, that long steering oar on the starboard side, required real practice. Small movements, big effects.
What fascinates me, the modern crew had to learn these skills from scratch. They had intensive training voyages in 2005 and 2006 before they dared to attempt the big journey.
That also shows that Viking knowledge wasn't something you could take for granted. It had to be passed down through generations. Every boy who grew up on a ship learned it from an early age.
And today, projects like the Havhingsten try to recover this lost knowledge. The return voyage in 2008, south through the English Channel in stormy weather, yielded entirely different insights.
In rough seas, the clinker construction proved its worth. The ship moved, it creaked, but it held together.
What also surprised the crew, how loud such a ship is. The creaking of the wood, the waves slapping against the hull, the wind in the sail. This was no romantic gliding along.
And yet, everyone involved speaks of a profound experience. When you're out on the North Sea at night, seeing the same things a Viking saw 1,000 years ago,
then you suddenly understand why they did it, despite all the hardships.
That connection to history, you can't get it in any museum, only on the water, with the wood beneath your feet.
A Viking longship was more than just a means of transport. It was a floating community where around 60 people lived and worked together in the tightest of spaces.
And this community needed a clear structure. Everyone on board had a defined role, from the oarsman to the warrior.
The hierarchy was interestingly structured. At the top was the ship's captain, in Old Norse, skipari. Then came the styrmother, the helmsman, who operated the side rudder. Commands were relayed by shouting. The open clinker construction made this possible even on 30-meter ships.
And the styrmother sat at the stern, with a view over the entire ship.
And now, a quick word from our sponsor. Feeling curious? Then head over to battlemerchant.com. They've got all sorts of medieval stuff, from costumes to armor and loads more. Totally worth a look.
And he was the one who coordinated the crew. On the 30-meter long ship, with wind and wave noise, commands had to be shouted loudly. Sometimes aided by horns, you might say. The open design helped. It's been tested with replicas and works surprisingly well.
And then there's the lookout. He had one of the most important jobs of all.
He constantly watched the surroundings. Rocks, shoals, other ships, weather changes. Everything had to be communicated immediately to the leadership. Safe navigation depended on it.
The rest of the crew consisted of oarsmen and warriors. The warriors kept their swords and axes within reach, but were also oarsmen at the same time. There was no separation between fighters and sailors.
The equipment on board was multifunctional. Take the shields.
They were mounted along the gunwale.
although probably only when entering harbours, as a show of power. On the open sea, the shields would have been too exposed to wind and waves. They were likely stowed below deck instead.
That's another example of the well-thought-out multifunctionality on board. Every element served multiple purposes.
Daily life on board was hard. The crew made full use of daylight. When there was little wind, they rowed, sometimes for hours. And the food was simple. Hard flatbread made from barley or oats. Today we might call it crisp bread. Plus dried fish, called stockfish. Smoked or salted meat, cheese, and beer to drink.
Beer at sea?
Yes, it kept longer than water, and was safer to drink. The Vikings knew what lasted. And whenever possible, they fished along the way, right from the ship's side. So they also had fresh food.
They slept on the open deck. The elasticity of the ship, the movement with the waves, made lying down at least somewhat more bearable than on a rigid hull.
Still, the cold, the wetness, hardly any privacy. That required a special sense of camaraderie.
And this is where the spiritual aspect comes into play. Many Vikings wore Thor's hammer amulets on their journeys. These were small pendants made of bronze, iron, or even silver.
They were believed to offer protection on dangerous voyages, a connection to the thunder god Thor, who was also responsible for the weather. On the open sea, during storms, this belief was certainly
a psychological anchor,
a source of confidence in a world full of uncertainties.
This faith was certainly part of the foundation, but the purely practical organization on board was equally crucial to success.
And this structure wasn't rigid, but functional. The warrior became an oarsman, the oarsman became a fisherman. Tasks changed according to need.
That's not so different from modern ship crews. Clear hierarchy, defined roles, but flexibility in deployment.
The Vikings were ahead of their time in many things, including the organization of their floating communities.
When we look at what we've learned about Viking longships, one thing becomes clear. These weren't just boats. They were floating worlds.
Small communities on the water. 60 people who depended on each other, with clear roles and an organization that was second to none.
And the craftsmanship behind it is impressive. The clinker construction, the splitting of planks along the grain, the selection of the right trees. Knowledge that, as we've heard, was perfected and passed down through generations.
What fascinates me most, without experimental archaeology, we wouldn't know much of this. Only through actually rebuilding and sailing do we understand what these ships were truly capable of.
And what the people on board had to accomplish. Rowing for hours, navigating in all kinds of weather, living together in cramped quarters. That required
not just physical strength, but also trust. In the ship, in the technology, in the community.
This combination of craftsmanship and human organization is what makes the Longships so special. It was never just about the ship alone. It was always the people who brought it to life.
And this story isn't over. In museums like the Viking Ship Museum in Roskilde, on sailing trips aboard replicas, in research, the Longships continue to fascinate us.
For everyone who wants to explore this topic further, you can find more articles about the Viking Age on the blog at battlemerchant.com. And of course, equipment for those who want to keep this history alive.
Whether reenactment, living history, or simply an interest in the past, there are many ways to connect with the Vikings.
Thank you so much for listening. We hope you took something away from this journey in the footsteps of the Norsemen.
Until next time, and who knows, maybe we'll see each other on a Viking ship someday.
That would be something. See you then.
And so we ride towards the end of this episode. Keep your sword sharp and your mugs full. We'll catch you in the next one.